Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a video series and or podcast about the topic of designing better miniature games, which is something that Glenn and I find ourselves compulsively doing, designing miniature games, that is. I hope they get better each time. But the purpose of these conversations is really to help us get better each time by talking about this stuff and trying to come to some realizations and conclusions that you, gentle listener, might also gain some pleasure or insight from. So we were both pleasurably and insightfully talking, I think, last time about world building. So I've been busily creating a fantasy setting for a fantasy game that I've been writing called Hobgoblin. And so we talked at length, I think, really last conversation about why you should have some setting and how much setting you should have and what the purpose for doing that world building is. But we didn't really, in that conversation, get to the how to do the world building or what it is that you could and should do. And I guess I'll prefix this conversation as I did the other one with, I'm not a super expert on this. I've spent a lot more time working on tabletop miniature rule sets than I have on tabletop miniature settings, but you know, Gaslands has a setting and A Billion Suns has a setting, and some people like them. And I'm right in the middle of working on this probably most ambitious of my game settings so far. So I think it might be profitable just to sort of chew on some of the things that I'm going through at the moment. Certainly, from my point of view, I'd like to reflect on it and analyze it.
So I guess the obvious question is, Mike, in what way is there anything you sit down, you basically write a amateur fantasy novel and you give everybody some fantasy names and you give the places some other fantasy generic names, and then you attach that to a bunch of rules, and that's brilliant. Everyone's got a fantasy novel lurking somewhere inside them, possibly one that they wrote when they were 14 and has a lot of stabbing in it. How is this not a thing that's basically this? Surely this is the easy mode part of when you're writing. This is the fun bit before you get to doing crunchy, difficult maths to do with how to balance the combat between units. Why is that not the situation? I agree it's not, but why?
Well, I mean, it probably is for some people. I suppose this, like, unless you are particularly broadly skilled, I think you're always going to be minded towards or more capable in one area or another. And so I imagine that there are plenty of game designers who are working with more of a sure hand on the fictional setting than they are on the mechanical equipment of the game. But yeah, for me, I'm less practiced at this. So I found that turning my hands to a richer setting sort of stretched some muscles that I hadn't really had to stretch before. And so I guess to wind back a little bit, like, how did I start this process? Well, the first thing that I did was I wrote down a bunch of I suppose the first thing I did was I sort of just had a conversation with some friends and I sort of threw some ideas around, and they didn't really go anywhere. So I went away and I had to think about what the problems were that I was bumping into that. And then I wrote I guess kind of like a page and a half, sort of quite quickly telling myself what the setting might be. And so I'd kind of come up with a few ideas in my notebook and discarded them, and then wrote down this sort of, I guess, like, the sort of the lame first page and a half from like the background setting in your RPG, like really exposition-y, there's no skill or craft in it. And then from that point, actually, the first thing that I did after that was draw a little map. So my setting, as I talked about a little bit in the last episode, my setting for Hobgoblin is set beneath the frozen wasteland of a fantasy world, and nothing lives on the frozen surface, and indeed very little lives in the frozen catacombs of the first 100 miles or whatever. And then as it starts to get lower and deeper and darker but warmer, you find the bulk of the fantasy setting in endless labyrinthine caverns and tunnels and enormous caverns holding all kinds of mystical and weird stuff, all lit by candlelight and bioluminescent fungus. And then as you get lower and lower and lower, it starts to get warmer and warmer as you get close to the core. And so at the base of the setting, you find, you know, fire demons and magnaphants, whatever those are, and, you know, giant spiders that live in magna pools, and probably some kind of infernal dwarfs that use, you know, all the lava to power their vast machines, and so on and so forth. So I drew a little sort of schematic, a sort of plan of that world, sort of like a, you know, just any world map. It's just that I was like, oh, well, cool. My conceit is, instead of a world map being flat, you turn it on its side and you're sort of looking at cross section like an ant's nest. What can we do with that? And that sort of sketched out a few very crummy ideas of like the sort of stuff that I wanted to be in the world. And then I guess I hit a bit of a brick wall at that point. And the person that I'm working with to get it published said, what would be really cool is if this wasn't filled with exposition, but was told from like the eye level of the halberdsman, like let's see what it feels like to sort of wander around in this realm, which fits really nicely with, as I've talked about before, like quite often when I'm exploring a setting that I'm inventing, I will go and role play in that setting because I literally want to, or as close to literally as I can, want to walk around and sort of poke it and see what happens, and have to be forced to like open a door and be forced to imagine and invent what's behind that door. And those skills of, you know, both playing and GMing role-playing games end up being very, very adjacent to the imaginative act of being like, let's draw a little castle here. What do we know about this castle? Okay, let's make up some things that we know about this castle. Yeah, and then so this idea of like, what does it look like from the halberdsman's eye line got me to start writing, I guess what I was sort of approaching as microfiction, which is like, can I tell a little bubble of a moment that happens inside this world? Can I just sort of have a little fight or an interaction or someone running away or somebody walking into an area? And so I started listening actually to podcasts and interviews about the sort of flavor text that you find in Magic the Gathering, because I wanted to understand a little bit about how people who write microfiction think. And I read a really interesting article from a video game designer, the person who made Cultist Generator. And Cultist Generator is filled with these teeny little moments of description, which sort of gently reveal the world to you piece by piece. And I was wondering, is this how my book Hobgoblin is going to reveal the world? And honestly, I found that act of writing little moments of fiction excruciatingly difficult, because I've spent a lot of my life writing incredibly technical prose, you know, descriptive technical descriptions of things for my work, or war game rules, which are themselves highly technical language. And I just didn't know what the pieces, like I didn't know how fiction writing even works. Like I've never sort of critically analyzed and understood like, how is this set of sentences in a fantasy or fiction book functioning to communicate meaning to me. And so I wrote a bunch of bad fiction and then got some lovely feedback on it from a friend to try and sort of help sharpen those muscles. But the act of like forcing myself to put imagination into words it reduced the uncertainty to little moments of certainty. And I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure now that there's a castle, like a white shining keep on a mirrored lake, and that's somehow underground. And like trying to, like, having resolved that image on my mind, it's like, okay, I've got one landmark, like what's nearby that. The other thing is, and this is no joke, as I was in the beginnings of this, really trying to explain it, my two girls, who are 5 and to demand a make-up story every night before they go to bed. So I just started telling the make-up story set in this underground world that I was working on, and I was sort of took the opportunity to explain it to my 5-year-old on the way down to school, just to sort of see if anything that I said got her excited, or anything that I was saying got me excited. And so I guess that goes back to that first point of like, I do quite a lot of world building through conversations with people.
I suppose one of the things I think that's tricky, one of the traps that people fall into, I think, possibly, is that it's easy to be quite self-indulgent when you're writing your fantasy world. It's the thing that makes bad teenage poetry. It's the thing of, I don't, there aren't hard technical things to learn here. I write whatever comes into my head. I write until I think I've completed the story that I'm telling, and then that'll be great, and nobody can sort of really judge it. Whereas I think the thing to accept is that there are serious skills and techniques and technical, abilities to find within the writing of the flavor text and the world background, in exactly the same way as there is for writing the rules. There are serious things. And I think one of the things that's particularly interesting for me personally about background text for a rule set is that it has serious technical jobs to do.
Mm-hmm.
It has to, for example, on the simplest level, explain why these people are fighting those people, and why they're constantly fighting them. Like, all they ever do with their life seems to be fighting them. And also, I think one of the things that's interesting is that you, particularly in a fantasy war game setting, you have to explain why it is that humans are fighting humans and orcs are fighting orcs. Like, Warhammer Fantasy Battle, I think, as a background setting, is brilliant for this, because there's always a good reason why two forces that are of the same like race or group or whatever would actually be fight. Every single Warhammer Fantasy Battle race has got these inbuilt conflicts, and to the point where it's like, after you've read like the 12th different sort of background book that explains why these people also have constant civil wars going on, it's a bit like, it's a coincidence. There's 12 different races, all which have a differently motivated
Riddled with civil wars
at any given moment. But that's because somebody somewhere has gone, okay, look, this background has to do a job. It has to do a serious job. It has to explain why this. You would assume that the Empire in Warhammer, given the ongoing apocalypse that is occurring within that particular universe, given that they are assailed on all sides by all manner of horrifying and terrible monsters, they would be like absolutely unified at all points. You would never consider stabbing another human being.
Right, exactly as you find in the real world, Glenn.
Well, I mean, to be fair, the number of hill demons that are attacking, Britain is minimal. So, you would think, what, if there was an actual horned demon with big wings and a flaming sword who occasionally turned up and hacked Boris Johnson's head off, I might feel differently about whether or not, to
collaborate to make sure that happens.
Yes. But a fantasy setting, a fantasy war game setting, has to say, yeah, despite all that, still occasionally, a brother.
Yeah, and so the way that manifests beyond the obvious, which is like continually asking myself questions like, where are have I got enough battles? Like, is this have I explained this like conflict well enough? Is that as I was writing, like, because to a degree I was just writing this fiction to get it out of my brain, to be like, well, let's just try writing some of this stuff. And so I was walking through Canterbury, and for those gentle readers who know Canterbury, it has running through it an ancient little river which runs under a bridge, and you can take a little punting boat under the bridge, and you can sort of look underneath this old friar's hospital and look at the strange sort of dribbly little stalactites that sit underneath it. And so I love that particular bit of Canterbury. Like that's just a very enchanting area. So I immediately just started writing a little bit about, you know, this sort of rogue character who's gently, like silently paddling a boat, hears a sound, you know, maybe there's some she's going to be found out because somebody's opened a toilet and she's trying to get to her, like her buddy, to get some news that they've been discovered so that they can escape from the underground city before they get captured by the new, like the guards have been bought out by the new ruler who's just turned up with a bunch of coin and now everything's up in arms. And it's like actually completing that thing and going through the effort of making that work, like it's just going to get cut out. It serves no purpose. It's the wrong kind of story because it doesn't serve any like that would be great in Hobgoblin, the role-playing game, where it's all about sneaking around towns and doing jobs for coin, but this isn't anything to do with that. And so I guess it's partly that it is your fiction answering the right questions, but also like just making sure that the scale and the scope and the subject matter is exactly what it needs to be, because the world building is a very intoxicating thing where, you know, I can go off and figure out exactly what kind of fungus beer they brew, and I can go over here and find out exactly how they make cartwheels when they don't have any wood underground, some of which might directly be relevant, but much of it is just like, it's just nonsense and it's just self-indulgent. And for me, some of that self-indulgence is fine because it's giving me the confidence to speak about this world that I'm creating, but it doesn't necessarily have to end up being words that everyone else has to suffer through.
Yeah, I think that there is I think there's a point where it's like, okay, if I'm enjoying this bit of writing too much, I should maybe be a teeny bit afraid of it, because if I'm really enjoying this, it might be no good to anybody other than me, you know. And that's not to say that it's like, oh, it should all be a slog and you should be doing things and going, well, this must be a good thing because it's absolutely horrible to be, I'm hating every minute of it, so it must be genius. Doesn't by any means follow. But I think certainly there are times when you're like, I'm really enjoying creating my little world. Maybe to sort of try and track yourself back to what your job here is and what you're trying to do. It reminds me to a degree of a story I think I related to you when you were talking about the world building for Hobgoblin, in relation to Terry Pratchett's Discworld. So there was a chap who put together all the references in relation to Ankh-Morpork, the sort of big city in the Discworld, and mapped out Ankh-Morpork because it said, okay, this guy shoots an arrow at this guy in this building, so this thing needs to be visible from there. And he mapped out the whole city, and it's lovely, and they published it. And then what he went on from that point to do was he then tried to do a map of the Discworld based on references of, okay, this town is this distance from that town, and you can see a mountain from here, and etc., etc. And he mapped it all out, and he's very happy. And he went off to Terry Pratchett to say, oh, I've mapped out the world now as well. Can we publish this? And apparently Terry Pratchett went, I mean, sure, maybe, but just out of curiosity, let's give it to a geologist, you know. And the geologist then went, oh, well, this is horrible. This is absolutely terrible. You can't have a mountain there and a desert there. That desert would definitely be a swamp. And you can't have a swamp in, you know, one of the places that a lot of people, I think, start with their world building is everyone likes to sit down and draw a map. Great fun drawing a map. The thing is that maps follow rules, very strict and very specific rules as to
it's
what
magic, man. Magic made it. It's magical desert.
I mean, but that's the thing. If the whole structure of your world is literally created and maintained, mind you, by magic, it's not just that magic made the desert. Magic then continued to shelter the desert from the rain runoff from the mountain over there. And everywhere you walk in this world, there are magical force fields that don't let water through and siphon off the water table underground to somewhere else. Then you better include that into your world building, because that's a weird phenomenon to be going on in that world. And I mean, I just say that in order to reference back to the fact that, you know, a lot of these things that are damn good fun when you're putting them together and very jolly when it's for yourself and you're just drawing a map and then you're going to role play it. None of your friends are going to go, just a moment, that freshwater lake, wouldn't that have salt water in it? Well, you know,
Mm.
if you're going to sort of put it out into the world, and you're sort of trying to build something upon it, and also I'm a big believer personally that the sort of the great writers and the great novelists know the thing that you haven't asked them, that they put in the research and they put in the work, and it might never come up in the book that a certain thing is true, but they do know the mechanics. That, you know, Tolkien is a great example, I think, of somebody who knew an awful lot about the world he was writing about that he never put into any of the books, because, you know, and I think,
But I think he's one of the few. I don't believe this. I know that we're just acting on faith here. Like, I don't believe that to be true. I feel like it's more likely that writers are clearly researching things as they go along to make sure that there are accurate details. But I think that Tolkien represents a bizarre obsession, because he works on this one fantasy world for his entire adult life without pause. Or like, he didn't make several, he didn't do 6 books in one and then 6 books in something completely different. Like,
I mean, I don't want to be sort of disparaging of any author's work, but what I would say is, I mean, you can take as an example J.K. Rowling, and there are repeated points in the Harry Potter universe where the explanation is magic. Magic happens, doesn't it? And throughout those books, you can feel like there's an underlying sense of, I don't really need to figure out how even magic works. It doesn't matter. It's not like it's another form of physics or something. It just cheats. It just cheats all the time, and we can just cheat at any point we want to. And for me personally, and everyone has different tastes, and obviously they're massively popular books, I'm one, you know, I'm one of those people who sort of always feels ripped off when I feel like the author is cheating. And I think that, you know, personally, I think that the more that the author knows why their universe isn't cheating, why it isn't breaking the rules, you know, the better the fiction that they're
listen, I read Greg Egan novels like the best of them, so I'm with you. I'm with you on it. I suppose it's maybe it was a reaction to the best authors have a good sense of what's underneath. I think there is a really great kind of author that has a really strong sense of the internal coherence of their world and has thought about all of these things. And I imagine there are also very popular and skilled authors who are incredibly seat of their pants and don't really care how the world necessarily is assembled. I'm not like, the one that pops to mind, although I have no evidence either way, is the Vore novels by, was it Brian Caitlin is his name, I think. Like, that just has a real seat of your pants set. Like, that stuff's just happening. It's just happening all over the place. It doesn't really matter. Like, it's just, you know, it's tastes and smells, and it feels like an artistic work where the internal structure is much less relevant than the sort of, it's a dream reality more than a, and I think that's okay. I think, like, there's nothing intrinsically erroneous about that approach.
Sure, and what I would say is, in relation to the difference between being a novelist and writing, you know, fiction for a tabletop game, you know, possibly there are some novelists, and you know, novelists who can do this are incredibly skilled in their craft and are professional novelists with, you know, years of training and crafting and building those abilities, and maybe they can get away with doing it in that fashion. But A, that's what they do, and they are incredibly skilled in that craft, and B, their novels aren't, as I say, doing a scaffolding, structure building process for another thing. You know, the narrative.
Well, actually, that's a super interesting point, actually, which is, to some degree, the world building has to be, the world has to be built in a way that it is accessible for others to build in, because just like in a role-playing game where the games master has to invent the scenarios and the campaigns, like, you as players have to invent reasons for your armies to exist. And so if, for example, it's a nightmarish dream reality Dante's Inferno sort of setting for a war game, where the selling point is literally any miniatures can be horribly converted to be some sort of every army has it's based on some kind of primal sin, and so you have to that would be really difficult. That's a really tricky thing to build an army for, compared to there are 4 kinds of elves and you can paint them green, blue, black, or another blue, where that's much easier for people to get hold of. And it's well, there are some places and you can get ships between them, and I can just understand all of that.
Yeah, and I think this, it should be said, I think that
has to be accessible in the way that you write it, I suppose. Or
within the sort of fiction that is useful for the job that is being done when you are writing fiction for a game system, I think it's necessary to have a nuts and bolts sort of understanding of the world that you're creating, and some of the practicalities of what have driven various people to various places and to do various things. And I do think that if you can get away with magic made it happen, if you are an incredibly skilled novelist and it doesn't matter, no one's going to be looking in that direction, I'm going to send them over there so I can just but those skills and abilities are incredibly refined and difficult to get to. And also, people aren't playing within their novels, aren't inhabiting their novels in the way that people are inhabiting a setting for a tabletop game. And I think because of that, you have to do a much more, in my opinion, I think you have to do a sort of more workmanlike job, and you need to understand more of the crunchy bits of the world that you're writing to.
This conversation makes me want to learn more about, I'd love to know if there is writing about, for video game design, how you approach the narrative and the world building for sort of a more linear narrative game, like a kind of an adventure game like Uncharted or something, versus the work that you have to do for a kind of open world RPG thing. Because presumably there are books written about how you write a Fallout world versus an Uncharted world, because I imagine they're extremely different, and that really the Enchanted world, the Uncharted world building, in my mind, feels more like the stuff that you'd have to do for a novel or maybe even for a movie, versus what you need for Fallout or Elden Ring, which feels more like an RPG setting book or a war game setting. But I might be misreading that, but makes me want to know more about that.
Yes, well, it is a serious and hard craft, and there are genuine jobs you are trying
to... Don't listen to us.
No, I mean, this is this as Mike caveated at the start, this is the sort of thing that we're less expert in than the other things that we've made comments on. Not that I'm going to say that we're expert in any of the things we've ever said here, but this is a world in which Mike's sort of feeling his way through more than either of us have at any point previously, and you're doing a lot of looking into various things. We had a conversation the other day about the fact that you're working through the place name creation and the language generation.
Yeah, and I discovered there's a whole sub community for doing a thing called Conlang, which is constructed languages, and one can there's very well established templates for creating a library of phonetic sounds that are used by your language, and then a range of syllable constructions, and then your syntax and your grammar structure and blah 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 blah. And which, of course, I immediately went, this looks like a lot of work. Where's the generator? Conlang generator, people. That's how you Google that.
But at the same time, there is a genuine thing where making up a place name that sounds like an actual place name without doing sort of River Ford and
yeah. Well, and it turns out because I'm approaching it from this map backwards perspective, that the place names are the things that I'm sort of obsessing with early doors. But do you know what? Like obsessing about the places and the relationships between the places and the names of the places and therefore who owns the place, that's led me to a lot of the imaginative work of trying to assemble the conflicts and so forth. So I mean, I guess it sort of doesn't matter which route in you go, but for me it was like trying to invent place names helped me concretize.
So yeah, I think if there are conclusions to be had here, it's that there are specific jobs that your fiction and your world building need to do, and try to keep your eye on those and not stray too far into the sort of slightly self-indulgent end of, I'm going to write a story about, you know, Jimmy's adventure within this world.
Or do stray into that, but just remember to cut it out again.
Well, yes, do it for your
Because
own.
I don't think it's worth a worthless activity going through that self-indulgence, because it might
No.
turn into something. It's just you got to remember to cut it out again.
Yeah, I mean, do it for yourself, for your own sort of burnished understanding of the world that you're sort of creating, and maybe understanding the places that the game has to go, but maybe don't necessarily force everybody else to read it, or at least force your publisher to put in an extra sort of 50 pages to a book in order to allow it to exist. You know, be aware of the possibility of self-indulgence. Don't sort of fish out the 500-page novel that you did write as a teenager and go, well, this is a work of genius, now we have to write rules, you know, to explain it to people. And yeah, you know, think about the ways in which, think about the things you're saying are happening in your fiction and how they relate to what your game allows people to do on the tabletop. Because that's the place I personally always come at the sort of game fiction from. If you say I can do X, I want to be able to do X. And if you say that doing X is a good idea, I want it to be a good idea. You know, one of my persistent pet hates is when you read sort of game fiction and it says that, you know, person A defeats person B, and then person B defeats person C, and person C, and it just goes in this continual chain of everybody being awesome all of the time. It's like somebody somewhere has to get their head kicked in, because I've put them on the tabletop and he gets his head kicked in. Believe you me, he doesn't defeat everybody all of the time. Other than that, I think it's probably therefore a good place to round this conversation out. Mike is still and will be for the near future in a process of ongoing world creation. So if anybody watching this video has some tickly or crunchy or interesting questions about world creation, if you've got any splendid advice for Mike as he's going through this spiky little journey, please drop that into the comments.
Useful blog posts or book recommendations, greatly appreciated.
Absolutely. If you have watched to this point, I assume you like some point of part of what we're doing. Please do like and subscribe. And like I say, drop us some comments in relation to, you know, world building, your favorite sort of level of text within a game. You know, when is a game sort of put in too much? When is it put in not enough? When is it absolutely nailed it and built a world that you can't help wanting to live and frolic and murder in? Other than that, look us up on social media. For now though, I think we'll sign off on this episode of Rule of Carnage. So we'll say thank you and goodbye. So,
bye bye.